Support comes from the Rosa Parks Museum on Troy University's Montgomery campus. Located on the spot of Mrs. Parks' historic 1955 arrest and featuring exhibits that chronicle the history of the Montgomery bus boycott. More information at troy.edu/Rosa Parks.
From Troy Public Radio, Troy University, and the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama, this is It Came from the Archives. I'm Greg Phillips. Each episode, we delve into the archives to bring you a topic, introduce you to someone new, or tell you a story about the Wiregrass region and the surrounding area. Our guide is Marty Olaf, director of the Wiregrass Archives at Troy University. People in the Wiregrass have known about Bishop Cleaners since it opened in Dothan in 1947. But few know that in November 1945, its founder was one of the fastest men on the open sea. Here to tell us more is our guide to the Wiregrass Archives, historian Marty Olaf.
If you know anything about Dothan, it seems like Bishop Cleaners has been there forever. Well, Bishop Cleaners didn't open until 1947, and the Eustace Bishop, which you might say empire, commercial empire, didn't get cranked up until after World War II because the Bishop family did not live in Dothan until after World War II. So something that felt like it had been there forever, it really hasn't been there all that long. But let me tell you about what Eustace Bishop was part of. He was a lieutenant in the U.S. Naval Reserve during World War II, particularly in the later part of World War II, and in November of 1945, he was part of the crew of the aircraft carrier USS Lake Champlain, code number CV-39. And that's important if you ever want to find out anything about a ship, to know that code number, and I'll tell you about that in a second. It made the fastest run to that date across the Atlantic Ocean, and it was a record that held until 1952. So what they had done is the captain of the ship, the Champlain, which had been converted from an aircraft carrier that normally had 90 to 100 aircraft on it to a troop ship that could carry 3,300 troops, wanted to get the soldiers and the medical personnel and all of the support staff who had been in Europe back to the United States as quickly as he possibly could. Now, I'm sure in the back of this guy's mind, for all of the altruism that sounds like, he's saying, if I can crank up enough steam, we can get ourselves a record.
We can get a record, right?
We can get a record.
Always, listen, Americans are competitive by nature.
Absolutely, and if they see a record that they can break, they're going to try to break it. At least somebody's going to try to break it. Well, this removal of troops was called, oddly enough, Operation Magic Carpet, and it was supposed to bring 3 million servicemen and women home from Europe. And this was really important at the end of World War II, not only to get people home rapidly, but because in World War I, the logistics of troop return was so bad that regular units in France took from the end of the war until May or June of 1919, 6-8 months later, to get back home. And what did they do in that time? They were just encamped. They didn't have anything to do. The war wasn't going to crank back up. After the first month of the armistice, World War I wasn't going to crank back up, and everybody knew that. So basically, they just hung out and, some of them drilled. Most of them wanted to go home. I'm sure they got in lots of trouble. A lot of them got the Spanish flu because they were just sitting in camp. And they couldn't get back. So the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy wanted to make sure, the U.S. government wanted to make sure in World War II that they didn't repeat that, largely because they had 2.5 to 3 times as many people in Europe as we had in France during World War I. But 2 major wars within one generation, which the logistics are across a major ocean, that you either learn lessons from that or you don't learn lessons from that. And they did learn this lesson. And so Operation Magic Carpet to bring these people home it was an Army thing, but they realized that they didn't have enough ships available in the Army, which, makes sense, that they had to call in the Navy. Now, if you know about the Army and the Navy, you know these guys don't like to call each other in unless they absolutely have to. Well, it just so happens that the first ship that the Navy dedicated to Operation Magic Carpet was this one, the USS Lake Champlain. It's a Ticonderoga-class aircraft carrier. It was commissioned in June of 1945, and then it was quickly refitted. I have some statistics about it here, some specifications. It was 888 feet long from stem to stern. Its beam at the widest point measured 93 feet. It weighed empty 27,100 tons. So reasonably sized ship, and it carried a combat crew of 3,450 people, although on this kind of trip it would not carry its combat crew. It set one west to east speed record when it crossed from Norfolk to Bishop Rock off the coast of England on an earlier voyage, and then it broke the east to west record, that return voyage, on its third voyage in November of 1945. Now, this was 3,360 nautical miles. They covered it in 4 days, 8 hours, and 15 minutes across the Atlantic from Gibraltar to Norfolk. So it started out in Gibraltar in Spain, as John and Yoko,
right? I was just thinking
Yoko talked about. Yeah, they sang about that, where they married, I believe. So from Gibraltar in Spain to Norfolk was 3,360 nautical miles, and they averaged 32 knots per hour. That's 37 miles an hour in a ship that weighed 27,000 tons.
Wow. So
they were cooking. During this voyage, Lieutenant of the U.S. Naval Reserve, Eustace Bishop, wrote a long letter home. And here's where he explained the captain's motivations was to, quote, to bring the boys into the States in a hurry. And what he noticed, because he had a lot to do with the mess, was that feeding 5,000 troops, his crew plus the 3,300 passengers, was what he called quite a problem. The officers' mess that he ran usually fed 350 men a day. On these 4 days, 8 hours and 15 minutes, he had to feed 550 in that same mess. So they were just churning them, just turn and burn, get those guys in, get them fed, get them out.
It's amazing almost that they could have the supplies to do so.
Well, they kind of ran out. They had a Thanksgiving meal. They had 505 pounds of turkey for that officer's mess, and it was gone so fast that the 96 stewards that Bishop was in charge of had to eat something else for their Thanksgiving dinner. What he warned in this letter was, and here I quote again, "You civilians had better be prepared for these people. Get plenty of food ready."
That's exactly what my family says every Thanksgiving when they're ready for me to come in. So I understand.
And there's not 3 million of you.
No.
Yeah.
Thankfully.
Yeah. Well, this record of 32 knots over a sustained period of 3,360 miles stood until 1952, when another ship, the SS United States, which was a 900-foot-long commercial ocean liner and had been designed to be converted from a commercial ocean liner, a cruise ship, to carry 15,000 troops. They got smart after the Second World War. They said, let's build these ships so we can switch them back and forth from troop ships to commercial ships. This sped on the east-west route at 35.5 knots per hour and returned at 34 knots per hour. That's 40 and 41 miles per hour. A 900-foot-long ship traveling 41 miles an hour. That's, speed feels relative, and 41 miles an hour on the ocean is way fast. Way fast.
And much like in the old record holders of history, as a result, the Lake Champlain kind of got lost in the annals of time, like the great running backs that have their records broken or what have you.
Right. Unless there's some reason that your name is going to live in history, you're going to have that pride of place for a while, and then people kind of forget about you. But because we received this collection about Eustace Bishop from his daughter, Carol Lee of Dothan, then we were able to find evidence of what happened inside of this collection and resurrecting the place of the Champlain. Well, the Champlain was mothballed in 1947 as a ship. They decommissioned the Army and the Navy rapidly. This was very common in American wars until after World War II. We decommissioned from approximately 16 million in the armed forces to 600,000 within 18 months. And that actually left us unprepared for our next excellent adventure, the Korean War in 1950, which led to a number of other problems. And of course, the Cold War led us to having a standing army. After Vietnam, we switched over to a professional army that's much more highly trained than the citizen army of previous American history. But they decommissioned the Champlain. They mothballed it in 1947, but during the Korean War, it has a relatively storied history after being mothballed and then resurrected in the Korean War. It was also part of the Cuban Missile Blockade Fleet in the fall of 1962 that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then it served as one of the principal recovery ships for the U.S. manned space flight in February of 1962, in which Alan Shepard rode the Friendship 7 into outer space. And then it was also a recovery ship for the Gemini 2 mission in 1965. It was finally completely decommissioned in 1969, and if you want to make little pieces out of big ships, you do that by scrapping them, which happened to the Champlain in 1972.
It's I understand the reasoning for it because it is a large hunk of metal, but it's kind of a shame because you look at the history that this ship went through. You're talking about the end of World War II, Cuban Missile Crisis, Korean War, the space age, the dawn of the space age. That's a lot of living history in those in between those walls of the ship there.
It is. It is. And yeah, it seems like a shame in decommissioning and scrapping these ships, but it takes an enormous amount of money to recondition these ships and make them. You don't have to make them seaworthy, but you have to keep them afloat if you're going to preserve them. And that takes an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of effort, and you have to have a place to put it, as we have found out with the battleship Alabama.
I was going to mention that. I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, and that's, of course, one of our primary points of pride. There is the battleship.
Absolutely. It's right there as you come in from the east over the I-10 bridge or over the causeway, Highway 98. It's right there. It's actually, I consider it to be part of the Mobile skyline, though it's not, it's obviously not like a big building. But I'll tell you, my experience with the USS Alabama was that I was a kid in elementary school in the 1960s in Huntsville. And we raised money to buy the Alabama and to put it there by buying 10-cent admission tickets.
Wow.
You could buy these admission tickets for 10 cents each, and all of us knew we weren't going to get free admission more than once, but we'd buy as many of these tickets as we possibly could, and we knew that these dimes were going to help in a small way. I'm sure that we didn't raise all that much money through this program to be a citizen and participate in bringing this important piece of history, the USS Alabama, to the dock where it is now in Mobile. But the Champlain, that didn't happen, and there are many, many, many ships that does not happen to.
Now, let's switch a little bit and focus as we wind down about what became of Eustace Bishop after the Champlain.
Well, let me go back just a little bit and talk about his life
Sure.
before that too. He was born in 1912 in Ashburn, Georgia. He attended the University of Georgia for a year, and then he graduated from Georgia Tech in 1933, where he had a pretty big profile. He was president of the student body. Then his family moved kind of across town to Decatur, Georgia in the 1930s, and in 1937 he met his future wife, Mary Alice Newton, who was an Agnes Scott College student, and I mention her because as part of this collection, we received her diary from her years at Agnes Scott and have transferred that to the Agnes Scott archives in an act that archivists call replevening. We replevened that. Yeah, it's a great word.
Yeah, I've never heard that word. That's
we
amazing.
replevened that. It means you give it away. Sometimes it means you give it back to the donor. But anyway, so he was working, Bishop was working as an insurance agent in Decatur, Georgia, and then he entered the U.S. Naval Reserve early on in World War II. But then after the war, and I'm not sure why this happened, but after the war, Bishop and his family saw some opportunities. They moved to Dothan, where they opened Bishop Cleaners. They expanded that by employing family members, and they opened another Bishop Cleaners in Albany, and then they opened one in Valdosta in 1953, 1954. They purchased 3 plants, both cleaning and retail exchange plants in Panama City in 1955. Then they branched out beyond laundry and dry cleaning. They went into emergency cleanup. They went into post-emergency restoration, and they went into actually what's fairly lucrative, uniform rental. In 1987, Bishop Enterprises had emerged. It had reconfigured from Bishop Cleaners and from the Bishop Company. It reconfigured into Bishop Enterprises, and it had 4 operating plants under the control of Eustace E. Bishop's son, Eustace Bishop Jr., whose nickname, I love nicknames in Alabama.
I saw this in the article, and I wouldn't be me if I weren't to ask about this nickname. You have to.
His nickname is Top. I have no idea how he got it. I hope he hears this episode, and I hope the family hears this episode and calls me up and tells me why they called him Top.
We would love to know the answer to this. Absolutely. That's a great, and you're right. The Wiregrass is home to some of the great nicknames in the entire state.
Absolutely they are. It's fabulous.
So we've reached the end of this episode, but definitely not the end of the Wiregrass archives. There is still so much to discover and so many more stories to be told on this podcast. You can find more information on your own at troy.edu/wiregrassarchives. If you like this podcast, be sure to tell a friend, and we'd love it if you left a review in the App Store. That helps other people find this show. I'm Greg Phillips, joined as always by Marty Olaf, director of the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama. This episode was recorded in the studios of Troy Public Radio and was produced by Austin Toy and Joey Hudson with help from Kyle Gassett. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We'll be back again soon to tell you another story, and you'll know it came from the archives.